Three of the tallest buildings in New York are right behind me on West 57th Street. Why are they all on one street? It's partially building technology that's emerged very recently, but also reasons going all the way back to 1811 and the original layout of the city grid and the commissioner's plan. I'm Nick Potts, I'm an architect, and today we're going to be doing a walking tour of Billionaires Row in Midtown Manhattan. When the commissioner's plan laid out these streets in 1811, essentially set up a hierarchy of east-west streets between wide streets and narrow streets. The zoning bonuses of simply because you're on a wide street, you get that much more height and that much more ability to build tall as opposed to a narrower street such as 58th Street. And if you think about the grid plan of Manhattan, and 57th Street is the last wide street before you get to Central Park. So it's really the only one of the wide streets that has access to Central Park. So why is West 57th Street the only place in the city that could have become Billionaires Row? It's partially because of the original plan of the city in 1811. It's partially because of the proximity to Central Park and the commodification of views. And it's partially because of the building technology and how over the past 20 years, the advancements in materials and systems have enabled people to build so tall and so thin. Over my shoulder is the first super tall building that was built on West 57th Street, and really the seed of what would essentially become Billionaires Row, of these super tall residential towers. So what is super tall? It's a tower over 1,000 feet. 157 is 1,004 feet tall, going all the way back to 1811. These sorts of buildings were not on anyone's radar. You know, this idea of building super tall just didn't exist. And this building type, the residential skyscraper, also didn't exist. This is 2014, and you can see in 157 a little bit of trying to figure out what to actually do with a residential super tall. There wasn't a precedent for what a residential super tall building would be. So the architect, Christian Portzenpark, really relied on metaphor, and the idea of the building was a waterfall. And as you see with these towers, anytime there's a new building type, similarly to the Woolworth building or a department store, there's always a struggle to find the right language. And this is probably one of those first experiments about, do we embrace the tallness? Do we try to hide it behind a metaphor? Besides the metaphor, it's a fairly straightforward, what you would think of as a commercial building that is actually a residential tower. When this building was proposed, it was almost like a shock. The only thing that was this tall in this area was the Time Warner Center, which is on the park and was controversial in its own right. But 157 freaked people out, and the imagery was almost terrifying. There were these overhead views, and it looked so tall. And now that you look at it among the buildings that have grown up around it, it actually looks quite short. And just in the short amount of time between 2014 and where we are in 2023, you can see how much this area has changed and how much the building typology has matured. The tall building behind my shoulder is 432 Park Avenue. This is 2015. The building is 1,397 feet tall and about 90 feet square. And the big innovation that happened with this building and why it's so tall and skinny, unlike 157, is that this building is all residential. You think about a typical office building is 300 feet long and 100 feet deep. It's a fragment of that. And that's because everything that's in this is apartments. So you don't have restaurants, you don't have office buildings that have peak loads of people coming and going. The discovery or the innovation with this building is realizing that with a residential tower, unlike an office tower where you need essentially one elevator for every 50,000 square feet, for a residential building you need far fewer, because you think about it, there'll be maybe 3 or 4 people on a floor at any given amount of time. Remember, this is one apartment per floor. So as in any luxury residential building, address matters, and Park Avenue, particularly north of 60th Street or the Park, has an incredible amount of cachet. And so what the developers did here in assembling the lot assembly is they actually found a certain slice of a lot that fronted on Park Avenue and gave it a Park Avenue address to give it the cachet of Park Avenue, though the bulk of the building is between 56th and 57th Street. So all of the 57th Street super talls have, because they're a new building type, there's a huge amount of experimentation, even in the style of the building. And this building really is a sea change, and thinking of a tall building is not being glass. And you think about it in particular against 157, which was the building on 57th Street that immediately preceded this, which is all glass and kind of tethered to a metaphor. The architect on 432, Raffaele Vignoli, decided to express this in a big exoskeleton grid. There isn't columns inside the building. What you see on the outside of the building is the structure. And the architects and structural engineers really brought back an older idea. Most skyscrapers have a curtain wall that does nothing, and then the columns and structure is all inboard. And with 432, the structure is the exterior, so there's not lost square footage. One other noticeable thing about 432 Park are the windbreaks periodically up the building. And this is another structure structural implication of building any tall building is you have huge wind loads. If you create an open pore space up the building so the wind can move through, it drastically reduces the pressure of the building. Behind me is 111 West 57th Street, and from this far away, one of the most noticeable things about the building is really its shape. This is the narrowest skyscraper in the world, and in order to achieve that sort of slenderness, there's a huge amount of engineering that goes into it. Notably the sidewalls, which are solid because the building essentially acts like a very vertical I-beam where the end walls are solid. It's really 2 townhouses wide. If you think about the structure of Manhattan blocks, these 25-foot wide lots, it's just a little bit wider than 2 townhouse lots and essentially as deep as one. So just imagine something essentially the width of 2 townhouses stretched up to 1,425 feet. And what 111 does is it takes that sort of setback tower form that we're familiar with from the 1916 zoning code and essentially multiplies it. And rather than have them be every 30 feet, it's actually at a very reasonable residential 7 feet 6 inches or so. So to provide essentially something that's scalable for a terrace for the resident. So the relationship of the 1916 zoning code and the 1920s commercial setback towers really resulted in this feathered setback shape where many residences and many apartments could get terraces rather than essentially 3, which is what the sky exposure plane for a deeper setback would have mandated. So this is a building that's really all about New York and trying to respond to both the city and the historical skyscrapers that existed before it, which were also experimental in their time, and also to the building that it's a part of. 111 West 57th Street is technically an addition to the 1925 Steinway and Sons building by Warren and Wetmore, who are the same architects as Grand Central Station. And the Steinway building is landmarked, which is something that the developer was supportive of. It actually rests within a courtyard of it, so it doesn't change the Steinway building, but it uses the air rights from a landmark building and transfers them over into the adjacent lot. All of these buildings are very complex, 3-dimensional financial and zoning puzzles. So the fact that this is added onto the Steinway building kind of talks a little bit about some of the history of West 57th Street between its first era, when it was a mansion neighborhood that clustered around the Vanderbilt House, to its current state as a row of super talls. In that in-between time, it was really a corridor that catered towards musicians, and Carnegie Hall is across the street, and that caused the clustering of people and companies that catered towards people who used and worked in Carnegie Hall to settle nearby. So Steinway and Sons built their headquarters across from Carnegie Hall essentially to do this. And at one point, 57th Street was known as Piano Row. The developer took a huge amount of care towards making sure that the addition both responded to and respected the landmark and brought its language into the future. And the materials are really used to bridge between 1925 West 57th Street and 2023 West 57th Street. If you look at the terracotta on the end walls, it's taking the terracotta language, which was used a lot in the 1920s, using some motifs from the Steinway building. If you look at some of the molding profiles around the front entrances, it's essentially translated into the shapes of the terracotta and then manipulated to create shadows. It responds to the sun and to the changes in the day and makes the building something different to look at and interesting through the course of the days, weeks, and years. And in the interest of full disclosure, and also in case you haven't noticed how excited I am by this building, I was actually the project architect for this building during its design phases with Shop Architects. The setback terraces, 111 has several of these, but at the windbreak floors, it's really one of the only places that there's a terrace that's not accessible to building residents. And we even have a chance to get up into the top one of those windbreak floors right now. So right now we're on the 86th floor of 111 West 57th Street. This is a windbreak floor. So similarly to 432 Park, these very skinny towers benefit greatly from having a windbreak, or a periodic hole through the building where wind can travel through and reduce the wind pressures moving across the building. So you have these on this floor and 2 more below us on 111, and 432 Park has some as well that you can see off in the distance. So in addition to these windbreak floors, there are also mechanical floors that exist. On 432 Park, they're actually within the same assembly, so that donut in the middle is where the mechanical equipment is, and they're also double height, so it's a zoning height bonus that they use. Here on 111, the floor that we're on is simply a windbreak floor. The mechanical floors are directly below us, and the tuned mass damper, which helps balance the building from swaying in the wind, is directly above us. Another interesting thing here is it's also one of the few places where we can see the terracotta up close, because the terracotta on 111 is on the side walls and not necessarily accessible to people These finials at the end of each of the setback terraces are really the only three-dimensional expression of it. And it's similar to, the team when they were working through this was thinking of the similar finials on the Chrysler building. If you look at the Eagles, they're about the same size as these. So, elements that are like this, that are twice as tall as a person, look pretty small from far away. And that's a bit of the kind of eye trickery that happens whenever you're dealing with a very tall or large building. Right now we're outside of 35 West 57th Street, and this is the only survivor of West 57th Street's first residential phase, when it was anchored by the Vanderbilt Mansion, just at the end of this block at 5th Avenue and 57th Street, which was the largest house in the city at the time. And this building, which was actually built for W.K. Vanderbilt, his brother's daughter, as a wedding gift, were exactly the kind of people that were living here. It was people who were related to or wanted to be near the center of power and the biggest house in town. However, this didn't last long. The house was built in 1891. By 1898, it had become too hustling and bustling. This was kind of the dawn of Midtown, which is what it is now. Anything south of the park was noisy and commercial. And by 1898, the bride had moved further uptown. You can see in the ornamentation this kind of Beaux-Arts brownstone carving. This was a fairly impressive townhouse in its day, but you can see the scale of it looks almost like a toy next to the new buildings. Behind me is the Osborne, and this is the flip side to the townhouse residential development that was happening just a few blocks further to the east, around the Vanderbilt House. By the 1880s, this was already starting to emerge as an apartment house district, and the Osborne was really the crown jewel in this. This was obviously a very high-class luxury building. Osborne, who is the developer of this, owned a stone cutting business, so it's very heavy masonry because he could get the material and was probably profiting on it. So this was a very tall building of its time, and if you compare it with the townhouse further down the street, you can imagine an 11-story building like this kind of looming over its neighborhood, almost as a prelude to what would come in the later phases of what would become Billionaires Row. In terms of the height and the technology, this is really at the maximum of what would have been built out of a masonry building of the time. You can think of it as being similar to the Monadnock building in Chicago, which is 16 stories in brick and has massive walls. So the Osborne, it's a stone building, but it still is similarly hefty and bulky and really taking advantage of the weight of its material. And it's a Romanesque style building, which is perfectly suited to that. It's heavy, it's about expressing arches, it's about heavy materials. It's an interesting juxtaposition to think about the Osborne, which was the tallest building of its district of its time back in 1890, to towering over it, Central Park Tower at more than 100 stories. Above me is the tallest residential tower in the world, Central Park Tower. This is 1,550 feet, and similar to Steinway or 111 West 57th Street, it makes a creative use of a zoning bonus. You can see how it cantilevers out over another landmark building, the Art Students League immediately next door to it, both giving them air rights to build over the rights that could have been built over the Art Students League, but also crucially letting the building rotate so there's more frontage by going over the Art Students League to get a little bit more frontage facing the park, which is just on the other side of the building from us. Aside from that, this is probably the most conventional of the super tall buildings on 57th Street in terms of skyscraper design. You can see, like 157, it's a glass tower. It's wrapped with glass on all four sides, which gives views in a 360-degree direction from the building. The floor plates are larger than what you see on 111 and on 432 Park, because there is enough room with the Art Students League to project out a little bit and get a little few more apartments on each floor. So instead of something like 432 where there's 2 or 1 apartments per floor, or 111 where there's simply 1, this has multiple apartments, particularly in the lower floors, 4 or 5 on the lowest tier, then 3, then 2, then 1. So you can kind of see each vertical striation as a different model of planning the inside of the building, going from large to small. This building also crucially makes the use of the lower parts of the building, which don't really make economic sense because they don't have views towards the park, for other uses. There's a Nordstrom department store occupying the ground floor real estate space to activate the ground plane, and then in between there's also a hotel. Even though Central Park Tower is probably the most conservative in terms of architectural expression, it's really the culmination of the lessons learned on the other super tall towers that have been built over 111 West 57th Street. If you think about its height at 1,550 feet, 150 feet taller than 432 Park, which was kind of the first major one of these, and also the real estate potential. This has a triplex that just listed for $250 million. So these buildings are both a competitive race to the top in terms of height, but also in terms of speculation and finding unlocked potential to recoup the investment of buying what ultimately is very expensive real estate. And this, the ultimate expression of Billionaires Row and all we've been talking about with these super tall towers, really could have only happened here on West 57th Street.